4, 3, 2, 1. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. So, no, you don't have to move if you don't want to be in the shot. It's going to be mostly Anthony. Welcome in, everyone. So we're really excited to have Anthony Sammarco with us tonight. He is a renowned historian, a very prolific writer. He has some of his books here, and that's just some of them. So we're excited to have him in for a talk on the Irish in Boston. And at the end of the talk, please feel welcome to ask any questions, or if you'd like to buy any of Anthony's books or have them signed, they will be available after the talk. And just before we begin, if you have your cell phones, if you wouldn't mind just making sure that they're on silent and they're not going to go off during the presentation, we'd really appreciate that. And if you do need to use the restroom, it's in the main part of the library, off to the right. And without further ado, Anthony Sammarco.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. No, that's actually going to be there. The whole idea is that this lecture is on the Irish in Boston. Now, primarily everyone thinks the Irish began coming during the Great Famine of the 1840s, but there were Irish in Boston even in the late 18th century. Boston, in some ways, would develop throughout the 17th and 18th century as an 800-acre peninsula connected to the mainland at what was known as the Neck, to Roxbury. So Boston, at the time of the Revolution, had a population of about 18 to 19,000 people. Seen here in 1801 is State Street, originally known as King Street, renamed after the Revolution, with the Old State House at the head. The Old State House, built in 1712, was the seat of provincial government, and Boston during this period of time, which was a town, would later be converted into a city in 1822. Boston was a small mercantile community. It had basically, by the period of 1850, close to 200,000 people. But Boston in this period changed dramatically, not just architecturally, topographically, but also in religion and ethnicity. Now, during that period, Boston, which had once been known as Tri-Mount, such as the painting on the right-hand side, would have Beacon Hill in the middle, Mount Vernon on the left, and Pemberton Hill on the right. It would later be corrupted into the word Tremont from Tri-Mount. But on the left-hand side is Boston in the early part of the 19th century. It was an area that basically had water on all three sides, and it was a mercantile economy. There were wharves that projected into the harbor, and we would see many different ships trading with not only the up and down eastern seacoast, the West Indies, the Caribbean, but even Europe. Boston during this period was changing, and the whole concept was Charles Bulfinch was the beginner of the change. Bulfinch had been educated at Harvard College. He graduated in 1786. He took the grand tour of Europe, and when he returned to Boston, he actually introduced neoclassicism. We call it American Federal Architecture, but he would actually design the first connected row houses in all of New England, which were called the Tontine Crescent. They were located on Franklin Street, between Washington Street and Federal Street. You can see it on the far right-hand side. They were not only beautifully done, 3 stories in height, red brick, painted stone gray to emulate the Portland stone of the Bath Crescent, but it were the epitome of well-to-do houses. But Bulfinch, during that period of time, not only cut down Beacon Hill and created the flat of Beacon Hill, creating topographical changes, but he was also somebody who would build over 21 places of worship in the city. On the far left-hand side is the Federal Street Church. It was a Unitarian church on Federal Street. When it moved to the Back Bay in 1860, it became known as the Arlington Street Church. But in the foreground, he designed the Church of the Holy Cross. This was the first place of worship for Roman Catholics in Boston. Bulfinch designed the Church of the Holy Cross, and it was on Franklin Street and completed in 1803. It was a federal-style structure that served a small congregation of French and Irish Catholics. So as early as 1803, a church that could seat about 400 people had been built. During this period of time, 1800 to 1820, The whole concept was that Boston was well aware of what was going on in Europe. One of the causes of the Irish famine, which would begin as early as 1840, was a disease called the blight, which destroyed the potato crop. The potato was the only food available to most of the people in Ireland, and the poor were cottiers and laborers who did not own their own land. They grew potatoes on small plots of ground and had no money to buy other food. The poorest group suffered the most during the famine because they had no other food to eat except the potato. And when the blight destroyed the potato crop every year from 1845 to 1852, the people faced starvation and death. Now, the concept was, by leasing the land from the British landlord, they had to pay a rent. That rent might include a place of habitation and a small lot of land. And the potato, which was something that can be nutritious, was only the one thing of the diet. In that way, one by one, they're falling round us, their pale faces to the sky. We've no strength left to dig the graves. There let them lie. The wild bird, if he's stricken, is mourned by the others. But we die in Christian land. We die amidst our brothers, in the land which God has given, like a wild beast in his cave, without a tear, a prayer, a shroud, a coffin, or a grave. But think ye the contortions on each living face ye see will not be read on Judgment Day by eyes of deity. This was written by Lady Wilde, the mother of Oscar Wilde, who was a great landholder in Ireland. Ireland had seen much of the British coming during the period of the 1600s, when Oliver Cromwell would take land to give to British overseers. Now, during that period of time, people would live in these hovels. Now, this is a great example. It's made of clay brick, and it does have at the top a very crude form of wattle and daub or thatch. But on the left-hand side, it was open to the air. One did not pay tax if there was no roof over the building. But in the foreground, during that period, even in the 1830s, it was a hard-scrabble life for many of the Irish. People realized in some ways that not only were they going to die if they did not leave, but it was said that by Boston's period of the 1840s, people such as Robert Bennett Forbes, who was a very well-to-do merchant in Boston, would actually gather other Boston merchants to send a relief ship. In 1847, Robert Bennett Forbes was appointed by the New England Committee for the Relief of Ireland to command a mission to Ireland to relieve the victims of the famine. He was lent a ship, the United States Constitution, for that purpose, and it was the first ship of war ever lent to a private citizen by Congress for a foreign voyage. Now, Robert Bennett Forbes had made his fortune in the China trade. We think of the China trade as beautiful Nanking, wonderful Canton China, silks, linens, as well as even spices. But he made his fortune in cocaine, and what he did was to bring it from India to China. He lost 2 fortunes, but he made a third, and when he returned and settled in Milton, Massachusetts, he was among the wealthiest people in all of Massachusetts. In the 1840s, he was a leading merchant, and he gathered many Boston merchants to take up not just a cash collection, but also foodstuffs that would actually have shelf life that could be brought to Ireland. And the USS Jamestown, seen here in a painting of the 1850s, was laden to the brim. It not only had at that time over $400,000, today the equivalent to close to $40 million, but it also had things such as hardtack, flour, sugar, things that could actually sustain an 8 to 10 week voyage. And when they arrived to Ireland and saw people not only dying of starvation, but they were simply dying in the streets. They arrived in Cork, or what was then known as Queenstown, and the people would see the distribution of all of these different things to them to help them. But there was a sense that not only the fact that if they stayed, they might die, but if they left, they had a chance. So it's said that 1 million emigrated to the New World, 1 million stayed, and 1 million died. This was a lament, and you can see a young man being consoled by the parish priest, his wife and daughter. And the lament says, "Oh, it's by the hush, me boys, and sure that's to hold your noise. And listen to the poor Paddy's sad narration. I was by hunger pressed, and in poverty distressed, so I took a thought I'd leave the Irish nation." It must have been difficult, but it wasn't hard if you had children. And many people realized that the only way to survive was to go in a coffin ship to the New World. Well, in some ways, they would actually gather where that person's possessions were usually auctioned off. They would then have to buy a ticket, and the ship, of course, left from Queenstown. The Gaelic farewell said, "May the road rise to meet you, may the wind be always at your back, may the sunshine warm your face, and may the rain fall softly upon your fields until we meet again, and may God hold you in the hollow of his hand." In this instance, they knew they were leaving. It was a sense that they would never see their family or friends again. And many people looked at it as something that the only way was on these clipper ships. Now, during the period of the 1830s and 40s, many clipper ship lines would actually plod the Atlantic Ocean between Liverpool, Queenstown in Ireland, Cherbourg in France, and then eventually the New World, whether it was Portland, Maine, Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, New York, or Baltimore. Seen here is a Currier and Ives print from the 1840s, and it said "Outward Bound." It's a 19th century hand-colored lithograph by Currier and Ives depicting a poor Irish immigrant in tattered clothes with a bundle of bedding, clothing, and on a dock in Ireland. He is shown reading a sign for the Shamrock line of packets, symbolizing the desperate journey to America. Stay and die, or leave the country and possibly have a new life. Well, in this print, it shows a man standing in the center, probably with his sister and his mother on either side, and you see a grouping of people, family and friends, seeing him off. He's to take the train to Cork, and in that instance, you see people in the background wailing because it was a wake. They would never see this man again. He would be dead to them. And it says, "I am bidding you a long farewell, my Mary, kind and true. But I'll not forget you, darling, in the land I am going to. They say there's bread and work for all, and the sun shines ever there. But I'll not forget old Ireland, were it 20 times as fair." You can see the desolation on the man's face. But he was one of 1 million people that would do this. And the whole concept was he was able to because of a man like Donald Mackay. Now, Mackay was somebody who was instrumental in creating transatlantic ocean liners. Donald Mackay established his shipyard on Border Street in East Boston, where he built some of the finest American ships over a career of almost 25 years. One of his first large orders was building 5 large packet ships for Enoch Train's White Diamond Line between 1845 and 1850, and these were the Washington Irving, the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-American, Daniel Webster, and Ocean Monarch. The clipper ship Washington Irving carried Patrick Kennedy, grandfather to Kennedy family patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., to Boston in 1849. So these ships, and you can see the launching of the Washington Irving directly below, were a major part in the immigrant steerage coming to the New World. Well, these ships were really quite large. They're nowhere near as large as an ocean liner today. But to give you an idea of the magnitude, look at the man in the foreground. He has a top hat. That's Donald Mackay. And then look at the ship itself with the men along the deck. These would take anywhere from 6 to 8 months to build, and eventually the rigging for an entire year. But they could hold up to 500 to 600 people coming to the New World. But they were also ships that brought cargo. And it was something that we would see things being imported to the New World. But the human cargo was the most profitable. You would not believe. It might cost £5 in the 1840s to come to the New World, but that £5 was more than many of these people made in an entire year. Often, the owner of the property would actually pay their passage, hoping that they would survive. But Enoch Train was one of the wealthiest merchants in Boston. Seen here in a portrait, he was an American shipowner and merchant, and he's known for establishing a successful packet service between Boston and Liverpool that later became known as the White Diamond Line. Ironically, this is a soup bowl from my kitchen china service, and when I was actually using it when I was doing this lecture a few years ago and I saw the tea on the for sale, I went, jeepers crow, I'm really living this lecture. But here is the White Diamond Line. It's a wonderful red banner with a white diamond, and you can see the T on the forecastle of the sail on the left-hand side. This ship is docked at Constitution Wharf in Boston's North End. It's still there. It was there that the USS Constitution was built and launched, and it became known as Constitution Wharf. But this was where the dock was located in Boston. So between Liverpool, Ireland, France, and then eventually the New World, Train would have upwards of 18 ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean at any given time. And in that instance, seen on the right-hand side, many of them did entail rough seas. But on the left-hand side, it says Train and Company's Boston and Liverpool packets. This was something that would show you the name of the ship, the date of sailing, as well as the cost. And of course, many people would have to save for ages to be able to allow not only themselves, but their wife and children to pass. Many people realized this was something that really did take place in such a way that many people would be crammed cheek by jowl onto these ships. Now, on the left-hand side, this is a Currier and Ives print of the deck of the back of the ship, where the steerage passage would be. And you can see trunks as well as all sorts of things, including a lifeboat. Well, a Boston newspaper reported in 1847 that, quote, vessels are continually arriving with vast multitudes of miserable human beings from famine-stricken Ireland, who were both physically and morally enfeebled before commencing a voyage with disease crossing the ocean with an unerring certainty. Complaints are made that the ship fever is by no means confined to the emigrant vessels, but that appears on shore, clinging to the Irish immigrant and breaking him down further in the country after he has escaped from the confinement of a ship hold, unquote. Remember, most of these people were malnourished. They had been starving. When they arrived on the ship, at least 15% would die during the passage. And those that did arrive usually had a variety of different diseases that would then be simply transmitted to many people on the ship because of the close confine. Many people realized if they arrived in the New World, hopefully, not just medicine, but also good food would be the aspect of nourishment. And this, of course, is a little bit of statistics. It says the potato famine resulted in the immigration of over 1 million Irish immigrants into the United States in the late 1840s and 1850s. Within a 15-year period, 1 million people. It says in the decade of 1820, there were 51,617 Irish immigrants, but Ireland's population was 6.8 million. Bring it to 1840. Irish immigrants coming were 656,145. Ireland's population was 8.2 million. In 1850, now you began to see 1,029,000 were coming to the New World, but Ireland's population had dropped to 6.6 million. And in 1860, now this is only a 40-year period, the Irish immigrants were 427,419, but Ireland's population had dropped to 5.8 million. It was incredible, and many people did try to assist in the United States. But ironically, not just the British landholders, but even Queen Victoria refused to give sustenance to these people. They simply died. Well, when people did arrive in Boston, undoubtedly they were met by family and friends. This is from Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion. It was an illustrated newspaper from 1852, and it says, "Immigrant arrival at Constitution Wharf in Boston." Well, in the center, you can see a man. He's dancing. He has an Irish cap. His mother, she's a widow. She has a widow's veil. And, of course, a sister and other people. But they're being greeted by a couple on the right-hand side that are totally Americanized. They dressed of the period, and they dressed just like everyone else did in Boston. So in that instance, the term greenhorn would come about for people that were new immigrants who basically didn't know, and of course the people themselves that were actually now Bostonians, but of first generation. This was a major feature because Boston in this period saw its population double and then triple because of the immigrants. What did they do for work? Well, most people came from an agrarian culture, so they usually had actually farmed the land. But some men became coopers. Coopers were important because they made barrels as well as wash tubs. These were things that were used in the fisheries as well as in the mills and grist mills. The woman on the right-hand side could actually weave a basket. But the biggest employment of all was for young women, because they became domestics in the houses on Beacon Hill, the South End, and the Back Bay. They spoke English, though they probably did know Celtic, but they also were able in that instance to get a job, to actually have a roof over their heads with room and board. They weren't paid a tremendous amount of money, but these 5-story row houses usually required at least 10 to 12 servants to actually operate it. Here in the kitchen, it's probably the housekeeper in the center, the scullery maid on the right-hand side, and it was something that they had one day off a week. Not very much, but they could go at least to visit their families. So whether they were a cooper, or a fisherman, a ditch digger, or a domestic, there was actual employment. But the problem was in the 1840s to the 1860s, they also were competing against poor Yankees. Now, not every Yankee was wealthy. Many of the Yankees themselves didn't have educations, and they worked with their hands. And during that period of time, it said in some broadsides, "Natives of the soil," meaning Americans, arouse. Shall American labor be protected against foreign competition in the home labor market? The watchword of Native Americans. Beware of foreign influence. Well, during this period of time, politics became involved, and many people felt that the Irish were taking the jobs from those in Boston that needed them the most. As a result, the whole aspect was these cartoons during that period of time, which were highly political, showed a man sitting on a keg of gunpowder. And if you notice, there's a little hole in the gunpowder because there's someone inside smoking a corncob pipe. And you realize that this was the idea. Boston was ready to blow up. But look at the man sitting on the keg of gunpowder. He was depicted as a savage. The Irish weren't human. You had to realize these were immigrants. They were competing against American citizens. But he holds a torch in his hand. And we all knew that within a few years there'd be a riot, there could be deaths, there could be a multitude of different things. But this was what was happening. The politics of the period began to portray the Irish as subhuman, just like any other immigrant group from the 19th or 20th century. This print on the left-hand side shows a group of men having a drink. But look closely at their faces. The faces are now that of basically an animal. They not only have rotten teeth, they have scraggly beards and crushed up top hats, and they're drinking whiskey, the drink of choice for the Irish. Now on the right-hand side is a bottle of Jameson. I serve Jameson at my home when any people want whiskey. But Jameson had been served even in the 18th century. But as you can see, they're not having a shot. They're having an entire jelly glass of whiskey. So not only were they slovenly, uneducated, heathen, but they were alcoholics. So what else could you say about the Irish immigrants? During that period, a new political party arose, and it was called the Know Nothing Party. And it was a national movement, but in no place was it as successful as in Massachusetts, where it was both anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. Know Nothing candidates swept to power in 1854, Massachusetts local and state elections. And under Know Nothing Governor Henry J. Gardner, seen on the left, the Massachusetts legislature moved to disband state militia units made up of foreign-born members. In this instance, the Know Nothing Party was said when they were asked, "What is the premise of your group?" They said, "We know nothing." And the whole concept was they actually instituted the Pledge of Allegiance and the pledging to the flag, as well as reading from the King James Bible in the public schools. The Know Nothings realized that Native Americans had to be beware of foreign influence, and the rising tide of immigration was considered a threat to Native prosperity. The Irish laborer was viewed with distrust as the Irish allegiance to the Church of Rome was suspect. So not just were they Irish Roman Catholic, and not just were they immigrants, but they had an allegiance to the Pope in Rome, not to the governor of Massachusetts. Well, many people looked at this as something that was really mind-bending. And between 1840 and 1850, 1.5 million immigrants came to America, a tenfold increase from the earlier decades in the century. The vast majority were either Germans seeking refuge from political unrest or Irish fleeing the potato famine. But regardless of the immigrants' reason for coming, their welcome was beginning to wear thin as they competed with the so-called Native Americans for jobs and housing. A secret society called the Sons of the Star-Spangled Banner was founded, and like other secret societies of the time, it had a secret handshake, mysterious code words, and elaborate initiation rituals. And the Sons of the Star-Spangled Banner banded together to secretly back candidates who embraced their nativist views. Here on the left-hand side is a cover to sheet music. Not only were they political, but they even had music to dance by. But look at the lower right-hand side, the three men. In the very center, it's the Anglo-Teutonic, the perfect nose. On the left, what does it say? The Irish Iberian. And on the right, the Negro. So they looked at basically the Irish as really no better than the African Americans. The Star-Spangled Banner was something in some ways that people realized was causing riots in the streets. But it was also causing a lack of employment. And this is from Brookline, Massachusetts, and it dates to 1860. It said, "Wanted, a good, reliable woman to take care of a boy 2 years old in a small family in Brookline. Good wages and a permanent situation given. No washing or ironing will be required, but good recommendations as to character and capacity demanded. Positively no Irish need apply." Now, one could be basically a very good caretaker for children, but if she was Irish and Roman Catholic, she was not even considered. And we saw these signs, "No Irish need apply," being erected in every window throughout the Massachusetts area. It was something that many people realized. It was a great deterrent. But many times by the 1880s and 1890s, they had to relent because they were the only people available to do domestic servants. Now here on the right-hand side, this is an original song, "No Irish Need Apply," and it was written by Miss Kathleen O'Neill, who was an Irish immigrant. And she said, "I'm a simple Irish girl and I'm looking for a place. I've felt the grip of poverty, but sure, that's no disgrace. 'Twill be long before I get one, though needed it's hard I try, for I read in each advertisement, no Irish need apply. Alas, for my poor country, which I never will deny, how they insult us when they write, no Irish need apply." Well, this was set to music and danced on Saturday evenings, if they were able to go to a dance from the house in which they were employed. So people looked at this as something as an affront. Miss O'Neill basically looked at it as something that was a joke, and she wrote a little song for it. But Boston, by the period of 1860, was a place that was totally different than 1800 when we saw that original photograph of State Street. Boston, as the wild eagle and wild goose see it, on the left, was a detail of a photograph taken by James Wallace Black from Samuel King's hot air balloon called the Queen of the Air. In 1863, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, quote, "Boston, as the eagle and wild goose see it, is a very different object from the same place as the solid citizen looks up at its eaves and chimneys," unquote. In 1870, Boston's population was 250,000 people, of which one half were immigrants or the children of immigrants. So you began to see, after the Civil War, Boston was changing radically. And it wasn't just through topographical changes, the infilling of the South End, the infilling of the Back Bay, but it was also showing that immigrants were now equaling the people who were native born. In that way, people that came to Boston went the gamut. Does anybody recognize this man? This is John Boyle O'Reilly. And John Boyle O'Reilly was a criminal from Ireland. He was somebody who had stolen a loaf of bread, and he was actually exiled to Australia just for a loaf of bread. Well, he was well educated and very literate. He escaped from Australia and he came by boat to Boston. And he became not just a well-known poet, but he was also the editor of the Boston Pilot. If you're Roman Catholic, I'm sure you read this every Friday from cover to cover. But the Pilot started in 1831, not just as the religious paper of the Roman Catholics of Boston, but also as a place to place an ad to try to reconnect with family or friends might be living in Boston. Seen here on the cover, the Boston Pilot with the saints in the very center, this was a major voice piece for the people in Boston. And John Boyle O'Reilly, Irish immigrant, was well respected. He was educated. And of course, the Pilot, which many people didn't read, was something in that instance that he was respected for. So in that instance, by that period, the Pilot would also not only have religious articles, but they'd have political ones. Now, we're looking at two men in a political cartoon from 1870. On the left is Mr. Irish Whiskey, and on the right is Mr. German Lager Beer. The man on the left holds a shillelagh above his head, and of course, we all know the Irish overdrink Irish whiskey. And on the right is a man as a German immigrant who, of course, enjoys lager beer. What do they hold between them? The ballot box. Now, you might be an immigrant in 1840, but your son, who was born in 1842 when you arrived, would be of voting age within 20 years. And he had the vote because he was a native-born citizen of Boston. The ballot box was what changed Boston's perception of immigrants. Now, if we all were green and this side of the room was yellow, we would say, well, I'm going to vote for the green person because they'll probably represent my aspect of what I think society should be all about. But then the other people who were yellow would say, well, I'm going to vote for the yellow candidate. Well, whatever candidate you voted for would represent you in not only the House of Representatives, the House, the Senate, and maybe even as mayor of the city of Boston or governor. So the ballot box was the great equalizer. And the vote, excuse me, ladies, was only held by men. And in that period, you began to see it transformed the city. Now, during that period of time, people were moving up on... I don't move. This thing keeps going in and out. I hear this going, too. Oh, there it is. Thank you very much. So the whole concept was they've been moving up. Some had been, men who made barrels, others domestics. Well, this is our new citizen, Officer O'Rourke. Officer O'Rourke had become a member of the Boston Police Department. And it says an Irishman has joined the police force and is now addressed as Officer O'Rourke. He wields authority as well as a billy club as he walks his police beat. Well, at the end of the first decade in America, Officer O'Rourke has continued his journey upward, mobility to become Mr. Rourke, implying that he has entered American politics, an option now open to him as a newly minted United States citizen. In becoming an American, he has turned away from the many of the signifiers that identify him as Irish. But look at his face. He still has that same face that we saw the three men enjoying a whiskey. But this was the beginning of the assimilation of the Irish into Boston society. And we see in that instance that not only did they become police officers, but they began a massive building campaign of places of worship. Now, the original Church of the Holy Cross later became known as the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in 1828. It actually was sold and would move to the South End in the 1870s. This, of course, is the Immaculate Conception Church, now condominiums, but it was the Jesuit fathers that would actually operate this on Harrison Avenue in the South End. This was built in 1863, designed by Gridley J. Fox Bryant, great architect, but it was built of limestone and granite and was enormous. It could seat 1,100 people, and it was supposed to have had 5 masses every Sunday. It was also adjacent to Boston College. Now, Boston College was established in 1863 by the Jesuits who ran the Immaculate Conception Church. Boston College was for the new Irish immigrants' sons and grandsons who were not accepted into Harvard and Harvard University. In this instance, located in the South End until 1912 when it moved to Chestnut Hill, it was a great example of this force of education by showing many of the young men the ability to rise above the station of their fathers and grandfathers with education, to become attorneys, doctors, lawyers, and many people did. The South End was an important part, but so too was in South Boston. And this man, Andrew Carney, on the right-hand side, would eventually establish Carney Hospital. Now, Carney had come to this country in 1813. He was a very early Irish immigrant. He went into partnership with a man named William Sleeper, and they had a tailoring business called Sleeper and Carney. They did well. Sleeper used his money to found Boston University. Carney used his money to establish Carney Hospital. And originally it was in South Boston on Telegraph Hill. You can see the building here. It was actually staffed by the sisters of Victory de Nemours. And these are the women with the huge wimples. And of course it was something that was free and open to charge without any charge on the public, and free to people of any walk of life, whether it was religion, race, or ethnicity. It was something that was an important feature. But they also had, of course, the House of the Good Shepherd. So these institutions established within the first and second generations of the Irish immigrants in Boston provided not just orphanages, places of education, but the House of the Good Shepherd was established in 1867. It was located on Huntington Avenue opposite Parker Hill Avenue in Roxbury. It was founded by Bishop Williams of Boston, and its object was to, quote, to provide a refuge for the reformation of fallen women and girls. And managed by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, it has provisions for 150 girls and women of all creeds and denominations, with shelter, food, and employment, and instruction in religion and good morals, as well as reading and writing. So whether it was the House of the Good Shepherd for girls, the St. Vincent's Orphan Asylum for boys, these were things that were now beginning to provide care for the generation of young children that were really with the burden of the Irish immigrant. But the greatest claim that the Irish had in Boston was the building of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston's South End. This was designed by Patrick Keeley, who was a master of Gothic Revival architecture. And the cathedral was constructed of Roxbury pudding stone and limestone, the materials native to the Boston area. It was dedicated in 1875 by Archbishop John J. Williams, and it became the largest Catholic church in New England. It was built on filled land. The south end only had a small area along Shawmut Avenue that was solid land called the Neck. But they infilled it with pilings, but the weight of the stone was so tremendous that they never built the spires. But if these spires had been built, one would have seen the aspect of the ascendancy of the Irish Roman Catholic in Boston. Granted, this church could seat 1,600 people at any given time, and Keeley was one of the foremost architects in the country. So this aspect of religion, education, and of course social work was a major factor. But the biggest thing of all was politics. It was said that if you had children, you would hope that one son would become a priest and one daughter would become a nun, because nirvana would have been reached. But during that period, if you didn't have a son or daughter who became a nun, they might go into politics. Now remember, we had native born that could now vote. And seen here is Hugh O'Brien, who was Boston's first Irish and Catholic mayor, having immigrated from Ireland to America in the early 1830s. O'Brien served as the Boston alderman from 1875 to 1883, and he was chairman of the Boston Board of Aldermen from 1879 to 1881, and again in 1883. He was the mayor of Boston from 1884 to 1888. So now we had immigrants and the children of immigrants running against Brahmin candidates, and they were winning. And they began to transform the city of Boston into a city that now took the needs of everyone into account. One of the next of the Irish immigrant descendants, bless you, was John Fitzgerald. He served as mayor of Boston and a member of the House of Representatives. He was a United States House of Representatives. He also made unsuccessful runs for the United States Senate in 1916 and 1942, and governor of Massachusetts in 1922. Fitzgerald maintained a high profile in the city, whether in or out of office, and his theatrical style of campaigning and charisma earned him the name of Honey Fitz. His parents were Irish immigrants, and he was studying at Harvard Medical School when they died. He withdrew from school to raise his younger brothers and sisters. But he realized that becoming a ward boss for the North End of Boston, he could actually transform himself through politics to become somebody to be respected. Now, John Fitzgerald's warmth of character earned him yet another nickname, Honey Fitz, and he gained a reputation as the only politician who could sing Sweet Adeline sober and get away with it. A pixie-like character with a florid face, bright eyes, and sandy hair, he was a showman who could have a career in vaudeville. On the left was his campaigning button, for mayor, John F. Fitzgerald. And the primary polls are open from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. And he said the people, not the bosses, should rule. Well, he did become the mayor of the city of Boston. And it was said that he sang this song at every one of his political campaigns, both before becoming mayor and after. Now, you're the flower of my heart, sweet Adeline. This was something that was really quite the song. And it said, in the evening when I sit alone a-dreaming of days gone by, love, to me so dear, there's a picture that in fancy oft appearing brings back the time, love, when you were near. It is then I wonder where you are, my darling, and if your heart to me is still the same. For the sighing wind and nightingale are singing, are breathing only your sweet name. Well, he did make this popular. And the first thing he had to do when he became mayor of the city of Boston was move to Boston. He was living in Acton, Massachusetts, about 35 miles outside the city. And he moved to Dorchester's Ashmont Hill, a beautiful neighborhood laid out in the 1860s with large Italianate mansions. This house, 12 rooms in size, with a stable in the background, was on 2 acres of land, and here his family was photographed in the library. His long-suffering wife is seated on the right, Mary Hannon Fitzgerald. His daughter Rose Fitzgerald is on the far left-hand side. They were the epitome of the Irish Roman Catholic family. Now, the third generation by this point had now been educated, they were in politics, and they were well respected. And John Fitzgerald, though a rogue, was somebody in that instance as mayor of the city who would see his daughter eventually married to one of the finest young men in Boston. His daughter Rose had gone to Dorchester High School, but later she was educated at Blumenthal in Belgium. When she returned, she married Joseph P. Kennedy, a Boston Latin School graduate and Harvard University graduate. They're married in the chapel of the Archbishop in Boston. Her father had just lost his re-election to the mayor of the city. But her husband was somebody who went on to become the president of the Columbia Trust Company in East Boston. Well, it looked like when the company might be gobbled up by a larger competitor, Kennedy sent out the call to his henchmen for cash. Joe got his old Harvard classmates to back him to become the youngest bank president in the nation at Columbia Trust. And seen here, he was only 22 years of age, running a company as a bank that had over $20 million in investments. The photograph on the lower left-hand side says, Joseph Kennedy poses with his sons Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. and John F. Kennedy, and they stand on the car's running board. They were the epitome of the Irish immigrants who had done well. And in that way, he eventually became the ambassador of the court of St. James. On February 18th, 1938, Joseph Kennedy was sworn in as the United States ambassador to the court of St. James in England, and to say his appointment to the most prestigious and strategic diplomatic post in the world shocked the establishment was an understatement. Known for his profound Irish roots and staunch Catholicism, not to mention his plain-spoken opinions and womanizing, he was a curious choice as Europe hurtled towards war. He refused to wear the court outfit, which was pantaloons with silk stockings. He insisted on wearing trousers and white tie. But he was somebody who would be recalled within 2 years by Franklin Delano Roosevelt because he was a pessimist, saying that Europe would lose the war. Seen here in the 1950s, they kept a place in Palm Beach. They were not only wealthy, but they were now moving in a society that was not just Irish Roman Catholic. It was something that was on economics. Here, Rose Kennedy in the center, Joseph Kennedy on the left, Honey Fitz in the white suit on the far right. We see Ted Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Patricia Kennedy, and I don't know who the priest is, but I think it would be Cardinal Spellman. So they were well equipped to run a political campaign. Their eldest son, Joe, had died during the war. So now what they said was the next in line was going to be the new president, and that was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. This photograph of the triumvirate shows on the left Honey Fitz, his son-in-law, Joseph Kennedy, the ambassador, and now John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the wonderful war veteran and hero of PT 109. Well, he went to actually become an elected representative from Boston to the United States Senate. And here with Honey Fitz and his wife, the grandparents of JFK, he passed his ballot into what was then the West End branch of the Boston Public Library that had the voting booths in the basement. This, in 1952, began to transport him into world politics. And during that period, he was extremely well respected, even though he was a Roman Catholic. Well, in 1960, he ran against Richard Milhous Nixon. And the election of John F. Kennedy as United States President was the first Roman Catholic to hold office. And seen here, his parents, the president and his wife Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, are all descendants of Irish immigrants. Mrs. Kennedy's mother was Janet Lee Bouvier Auchincloss, the granddaughter of Irish immigrants. Granted, her father was of French descent, but her grandmother was born in Ireland. Many people always thought her as the sophisticated Vassar graduate. Seen here, Honey Fitz on the left's greatest nemesis was James Michael Curley. You probably have heard of him. He was the Robin Hood of Boston. He robbed the rich to give to the poor, and boy, did he rob. This photograph, which was probably taken around 1910, shows the two in a very cordial aspect, but they hated each other. James Michael Curley created a political organization known as the Tammany Club. It was named after New York's Democratic machine and organized picnics and Christmas parties for the poor. He did favors for constituents, providing a meal or a job, and, as we've seen, taking a civil service exam for a friend that landed him in a prison sentence. He recorded each favor in a notebook, expecting recipients to thank him with their votes. So this was a man who began as an alderman of the city of Boston and moved up eventually to not only mayor, but governor of the Commonwealth. The vote through the people was the aspect of transformation. He said he was the mayor of the poor, and if you believed humane, experienced leadership was the answer, elect Curley. This was a man who not only could say things in such a way that many people followed him from one part of the city to another, but he was reelected every single time. James Michael Curley would later build a mansion on the Jamaica Way in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. The mansion, built in 1919, faces Jamaica Pond, one of the loveliest areas. The house cost $25,000. As mayor, he made a salary of $2,000 a year. I'm not going to say any more. But many contractors said they did it because he had provided them with employment. Not only was it a 19-room house, he only had 5 children, but it was something when it was finished that had shutters, that had shamrocks cut into the shutters. So it showed the ascendancy of the Irish in this very Yankee neighborhood. Curley was somebody in a lot of ways that portrayed himself as the mayor of the poor, as he helped immigrants to adjust to urban life by finding them jobs, easing their troubles with the law, building them playgrounds and public baths, and attending their weddings and wakes. His feuds with fellow Irish politicians like John Honey Fitz Fitzgerald, Patrick Kennedy, and Martin LeMasney were legendary, and he tried as mayor to centralize patronage and make the ward bosses obsolete. And during the Depression, he used federal relief and work projects as a tool of his political ambitions. As it says, Curley, governor, character, courage, and Curley. He needed your vote, and people gave it willingly. Seen here on Tremont Street, outside of the Mission Church in Roxbury, he's in a convertible with his wife on St. Patrick's Day. He was beloved not just by seniors, adults, young adults, but even children who couldn't even vote for him. Everyone knew Curley. He did something for everyone, whether it was a widow who needed a delivery of coal or a family that needed money to actually buy food. He provided for everyone, it seemed, except for Brahmins. Now, seen with FDR on the left, Curley really did take care of people, but not nearly as lavishly as he took care of himself. Curley was as crooked as a pretzel. He forced city employees to fund his campaigns by purchasing tickets to Tammany Club dinners, and he signed sweetheart deals giving city contractors huge profits if they split the booty with him. He hardly bothered to hide his graft. But he was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States representative in New England. And of course, FDR had polio. He's actually holding him as he came to actually speak in Boston. So on the right-hand side is a little button that says Economic Security, Roosevelt and Curley. Not that he was running for federal office, but he was well respected, but in a very daunting way. And of course, seen here, he had license plate number 5. I don't know about you, but I know people that actually say that a 5-number license plate is fabulous. A 4-number license plate is even better. A 3 license plate number is really, my God, you're getting there. But to have a single license plate number is nirvana. In 1936, a Ford beach wagon driven by Charles T. Appleton II was stopped by police and the driver charged with driving under the influence of alcohol. On the car was license plate number 5. Appleton's license was suspended and Curley took possession of it. And this is still in the Curley family. So you began to see in some ways he had ways of dealing with people for what he wanted. But of course, he also had his biography written by Joseph Deneen, and it was called The Purple Shamrock. Joseph Deneen wrote a biography of James Michael Curley and told his story against that background ward leader and common counsel to mayor, governor, congressman, and mayor again. The author holds brief for him, thinking him wrongly accused and imprisoned, and gives him credit for new hospitals, attempts at some clearances, and new highways. Well, the Purple Shamrock sold by the thousands. People loved it because it told who was Curley as a real person. But Curley didn't think it told enough. So he wrote his own autobiography, and he called it I'd Do It Again. Curley, the man himself emerges, ambitious, magnetic, able, but wholly uninhibited, it would seem when it comes to ways and means of achieving his goals. That those goals were frequently admirable, and that the people were in the back of his mind constantly does not alter the end impression of Curley as a dangerous demagogue, bitter in his resentment of the Boston Brahmins, ruthless in his using tools at hand to pillory his enemies, and ready to attribute failure and setback and defeat again and again to the power of the pocketbook of the vested interests. Well, this book sold as well as Deneen's, and you can see the copy. This was my great aunt's. She would read it every so often and say, my God, he really was a rogue. But you began to see in some ways these were people who had lifted themselves out of poverty through either education or politics. And here, in the flower from Irish soil, these music pieces were done at the turn of the 20th century. Between that period and 1920, people would see these as things that would usually be played at Irish dances, kind of like Hibernia Hall in Roxbury. And the flower from the Irish soil, the words were, in the long, long ago in a little green isle, when childish hearts knew naught of wrong, a fair laughing lad and a rosy-cheeked lass wandered out through the flowers the whole day long. And when the parting came later, the lad crossed the sea, but a token of love kept his heart staunch and true. So wherever he wanders, in sorrow or gladness, he thinks of the lass or the waters so blue. He left the woman he loved. Many people left their family and friends. But when they came to the New World, they created an aspect that was immigrant. Oh, that is lost. It was not only the immigrants, but that they had done well. So many immigrant groups, whether they were from Western Europe, Central Europe, or even Russia, would come to Boston and create a thriving nexus of nations. So that today in the 21st century, many people living here probably think of Boston as something that is the broadest base it's ever been. It's not just Europe, it's Asia, South America, and many other countries. But the Irish in Boston, as you can see, not only contributed to the well-being of the economy and politics, but in some ways today, with St. Patrick's Day tomorrow, it was the luck of the Irish. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.